you spent a year in Afghanistan, 2011, 2012,
Hmm.
and then you go to the Central African Republic in 2015.
Yeah.
Do you think that that year in Afghanistan um, helped to prepare you for um, what you're going to do in the Central African Republic? I mean, they're very different places, very different missions, but
Sure.
in what ways, if any, do you think your year in Afghanistan helped prepare you for the Central African Republic?
You know, that's a great question, and really, I think the best way to describe it is, when you're learning a skill or a new skill or maybe a new language, you know, a lot of folks really learn from trying it on hard mode, right? Just diving in and trying to immerse themselves in that experience to learn a new skill or learn a new language. And so for me, learning my skills in human intelligence and how to collect information from human beings, Afghanistan was hard mode because these were all folks that were unlawful enemy combatants. We knew that they wanted to, I mean, not to sugarcoat it, they wanted to kill us, right? And so getting information out of those types of folks is incredibly difficult. Um, so now when I get to Africa, and I'm working more with people who want to make sure that the bad guys get caught.
Hmm.
Collecting intelligence becomes a lot easier because I've already done it the hard way. And so now when I have people who are willing to give me information to help us capture the bad guy, right? Or in this case, Joseph Kony, it becomes a lot easier to collect that information.
Because you
So,
have folks who are eager to help. Just real quick, I mean, what was the heart of this mission? You've mentioned Joseph Kony,
mhm.
so just the overview of what's that about, and what is the mission that you were part of?
Yeah. So this was a direct result of the Kony 2012 campaign. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but a non-government organization called Invisible Children back in 2012 released this video called Kony 2012, where they highlighted the atrocities that this guy has committed in Uganda, South Sudan, Central African Republic. He tried to overthrow the Ugandan government back in the 90s. And when that failed, he kind of ran off into the jungle and started what is called the Lord's Resistance Army. He would go in and he would go into villages and kidnap children. Um, he would make those kids then kill their parents before kidnapping them and turning them into child soldiers. Um, and so after the Kony 2012 campaign, there was a lot of pressure on President Obama to take action against the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony specifically. And so this mission was just that. Our mission was pretty simple: capture or kill Joseph Kony.
Now, I'm assuming that a lot of special forces and CIA are involved, which I'm then assume means that there's a lot you're not able to say.
I didn't really work. I mean, I worked adjacent to some folks in the CIA. They were really operating in other areas,
Okay.
but I was attached to a special forces team in Central African Republic, and that was kind of the core of uh, of the group over there. Were special forces folks, and I was attached to them uh, to provide some additional intelligence collection opportunities.
Now, you were Army. Are you allowed to say whether these special ops were Army, Navy?
They were Army as well. They were special forces group for
Okay.
the Army.
And are they then with local military forces, working with local military forces, basically hunting Coney?
We were, but we weren't. So we were trying to. What the special forces group was doing there is they were, advising and assisting other, of those local military groups. So the Ugandan People's Defense Force, um, the Central African Republic Army, they were training them in counterterrorism operations so that they could go. and look for Joseph Kony. We would, well, I say they would send one or two folks with them to help them on, on those missions and jungle missions, jungle patrols, things like that. But really, the main goal of the special forces group that was there was to advise and assist. Get these folks ready to go out and conduct their own operations.
I see. So you've mentioned you're doing intelligence gathering, debriefing. So who are you talking to in your gathering of human intelligence in the Central African Republic?
So primarily, I worked with former child soldiers. I would debrief them. A lot of them were kids that had literally just escaped from the jungle, from Kony, and were running to try and find any sort of safe haven, whatever it was. Now, luckily for us, Invisible Children had done a lot of work building a radio network throughout the entire country, especially in larger villages. I don't want to call them cities because they weren't really cities. They were just really large villages. They would set up, radio towers and, basically ham radios so that we could communicate from one end of the country to the other. And so if a child had escaped the LRA, or the Lord's Resistance Army, and they showed up to one of these villages with a radio tower, they would call in to us or to the Invisible Children group that was near us, and they would let us know. And then once they were able to bring the child back, I would, after they were checked out medically, making sure that they were, okay, I worked with Invisible Children to get some time to debrief them on what had happened and try to get any information we could on movements of Kony, or where he might have been located.
Are you only gathering information that's helpful for, the forces that are wanting to track down Kony? Are you doing that and gathering information about what the children themselves experienced, or would the NGO sort of pick up with that side?
So I did both. Again, similar to, how I operated when I was conducting interrogations. If you can build rapport with folks, that's going to make the information come a lot easier. And so I would sometimes I would spend weeks working with these kids, just talking to them, kicking around a soccer ball for hours on end, letting them be children, right? And getting to a place where they trusted me so that they would, open up and be honest about what their experiences were. Being able to build that rapport and build that trust with these kids was very important to make sure that we were able to get the information that we needed. One, to help them get the medical care that they needed, right? To make sure that when we sent them back to their home country, that hopefully they were in a place where they could be repatriated, right? Because obviously, being in that situation for some of these kids, it was several years that they were in these situations. It's almost like they need a reboot so that they can repatriate into society. And so I was doing what I could to build that rapport and try to help them be able to trust again so that they could repatriate back into society.
I'm imagining that a lot of these kids had horrible things done to them and had also done horrible things.
Oh yeah.
Which would also be one of the horrible things done to them, that they were put into situations where they had to do those horrible things.
Yeah.
So the purpose here is not to pry or recount horror stories, but as we're thinking of these kids, are there particular things you heard, of all the things you heard over a space of 10 months, Are there particular things you heard that sort of burn themselves into your memory?
Oh, absolutely. There's one kid specifically that I mean I still think about today. Um, when I talked to him, he was about 14 years old. He was taken from his home when he was 8. Um, so he had been in the jungle for several years at that point. When he came to us, he had lost use of his arms below the elbow because what they did is they would lash with ropes, they would lash 40 or 50-pound blocks of salt to his back and make him walk for miles and miles a day. And after a while, those ropes would burn in, cut into, right here, that joint right there where your shoulder, meets. And there were extensive scars and rope burns, and he lost use of his arms below the elbow because of the nerve damage and the scar tissue that had built up. And that's not something that's really ever going to be repaired.
Wow. Wow.
There was another kid that I spoke to that didn't even remember his name. They always called him Privat, which is French for private. And so when I asked him his name, oh, it's Privat.
Wow.
He didn't even remember the name his parents gave him.
How many children did you debrief? I don't know that you'd have a specific number, but if you just have a ballpark idea.
Right about 15 in the 9-10 months I was there.
Wow. And did you also debrief others who were not children? Was it primarily children and others, or were the children the only thing?
So the children were the main focus.
Yeah.
However, so a couple of weeks actually before I got into country, Dominic Ogwin defected. And Dominic Ogwin, for many years, was Joseph Kony's number 2. He was his number 2 in command. He defected. He walked out of the jungle, said, "I'm done." And when he left, he came to a village called Samawanja, and that's up in the northern area of Central African Republic. He, came out defected, and so, the team that was there at the time that I was getting ready to come in and replace, they debriefed him, and then they passed him off to the Ugandan government, who ultimately sent him to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. After that had happened, we started to go up and spend more time in Samawanja. We actually ended up renting a house from a local merchant there, and we were living out of that house. And we started to work with some of the local government there in Samawanja. But there was also a Sudanese refugee camp just outside of town there. And we started to work with some of them because, we hadn't confirmed it, but we had heard some rumors that he might have been kind of traveling in between, Sudan, Central African Republic, South Sudan, to get for the ivory trade, essentially.
Oh, okay.
That's how they funded their entire group, was through illegal ivory trade. They would go to, some of the national parks, in the area. They would kill elephants, harvest the ivory, and then they would take it to sell it. And so that was kind of their MO. And so we started to, work with some of the local government there, but also the Sudanese refugee camp, working with them a little bit. That's where some of the photos that I sent to you, where the kids are kind of sitting on blocks of cement. And so, we started to work with the Sudanese refugee camp. Well, what we had come to find out when we started visiting their camp is that at least what they believed were members of the Lord's Resistance Army were coming in and stealing the rebar from the cement. because that metal could be used for other things, whether that was shelter or they could sell it or whatever. And so some of the photos that I sent you, those were actually of the schoolhouse in that Sudanese refugee camp where LRA members came in and destroyed the desks and the seats to pull all of the rebar out of that cement so that they could either utilize it for their own purposes or potentially sell it. We were all in relaxed grooming standards for that.
For that whole mission?
Yeah, so the only times I would wear a uniform was when I was flying from Central African Republic back to Entebbe. Our headquarters was in Entebbe, Uganda, and some of the photos that I sent you is we're looking out over Lake Victoria there in Entebbe, which is the second largest freshwater lake in the world. So that was kind of a cool experience to see that.
So you served in Afghanistan, did intelligence there, gathered intelligence there,
Mhm.
also experienced the world of war there. You had this experience in the Central African Republic, talking to kids who had been kidnapped and made child soldiers. Both of these are pretty, pretty heavy experiences. If you could take them together, what's the main thing you learned from these two experiences?
I think the main thing that I really learned is that assumptions are more dangerous than we think. And I'll expand on that a little bit. You know, some of the most interesting conversations I had throughout my career were in very unexpected places. You know, I talked earlier about how I feel like we really underestimated um, just the sheer tenacity of the Afghan people. But I think there was also a narrative that was really written about um, Afghanistan in general and the Taliban in general, right? And supporters of the Taliban. But a lot of the conversations that I had in Afghanistan showed me that a lot of these folks weren't necessarily doing it for the Taliban. They weren't doing it because they wanted to kill US troops. They did it because they didn't have a choice, right? A lot of these folks, the Taliban had either kidnapped their family and said, hey, here's a box. You go to this place at this time and you bury it and you walk away and don't say anything, or we kill your family. Um, and so I think a lot of people, you know, kind of, or I don't want to say people, but I think a lot of the narrative around that was, you know, they want to kill us. They will do anything they can to kill the American way of life or democracy. But really, they were just in a place where they had no choice. Either they were going to starve and their family was going to die starving. And so the only thing they could do was get paid $20 to go bury a box at X location, um, or they would die. And you know, I think it's an important point to remember that the narrative that we hear isn't always the true picture of how it
Mhm.
works. And I feel the same about my time in Africa. Um, you know, a lot of people kind of assumed that, you know, these kids wouldn't necessarily be able to tell us anything of importance, that they wouldn't be able to help us find or locate Coney. But it's also, again, a matter of patience and being able to build a rapport with people and speak to them in a way that they understand. And so I think a lot of assumptions were made about these kids that had been so insanely traumatized. I mean, in ways that we couldn't really even imagine, right? But some of the conversations and some of the information that they gave me proved to be incredibly helpful. in how we shaped our operations in Africa, in Central African Republic specifically. You know, some of the information that they provided not only helped me out as a human intelligence collector, but it also helped us shape future missions for like our psychological operations team, for the command and control team. So a lot of people I feel underestimated these kids, but realistically, they drove a lot of this mission, and a lot of it was because you know the message was always the same with almost every single one of these child soldiers that I spoke to, and it was, please don't let this happen to anybody else. They knew that talking about what they dealt with, what they had to do was going to be incredibly difficult for them, but they did it because they didn't want anybody else's kids or children to have to go through what they did.
You mentioned Privat, the kid who couldn't remember his given name, but that was the name he was given, the French word for private. Do you recall any of the other names of the children?
There was a you know, kid by the name of Lewis. Felix was another one. Nieko.
Louis, Felix, Nieko.